Life inside a tank. The Mark V Tank, 1918. The arrival of the tank in World War I heralded a whole new kind of warfare that helped to break the bitter and bloody stalemate of trench warfare that had plagued the Western Front for years. And it was the British who pioneered the way in the introduction, development, and use of these fearsome armored fighting machines. They were first introduced during the Battle of the Somme in September 1916, much to the shock and disbelief of the German soldiers. These British main battle tanks were a series of heavy so-called land ships that all had a very similar layout, with over 2,000 of them being built before the war had ended in November 1918. There were 5 main models, with the ultimate wartime one being the Mark V. This was introduced in July of 1918 and had been designed by Major W.G. Wilson, a British Royal Naval Air Service engineer, and produced at the Metropolitan Carriage and Wagon Factory at Saltley and Oldbury in the West Midlands of England. The Mark V tank was not a radical new design, just more of an updated version of the earlier Mark IV tank. 400 of these Mark Vs were built and consisted of 2 versions: the 6-pounder gun version, which was called the male variant, and the all-machine gun version, which was called the female variant. 200 of each were produced. The crew compartment. Like all the other tanks in the series, they were incredibly hot inside, cramped and noisy with very little ventilation. The crew of 8 were forced to communicate by shouting, using hand signals and writing notes to one another. To make matters worse, the Mark V had a serious design flaw, and that was the new engine layout, which meant that there was the constant threat of carbon monoxide poisoning throughout the tank from badly vented exhaust fumes. And it wasn't unusual for crew members to collapse unconscious inside the tank. The driver's cabin. The one revolutionary and unique feature of this new model was that it was controlled by just one driver, using a gearbox with 4 forward gears and 1 reverse gear. This was unlike earlier models that needed 4 gearmen, 2 to control each of the tank's tracks. This previously clumsy setup had led to much confusion when driving the tank, resulting in many mistakes and accidents. The Mark V's driver had just a small slit to see out of, so if the tank was not operating in battle conditions, the tank commander would often get out and walk in front of the vehicle, signaling to the driver where to go and pointing out any potential hazards. Sat next to the driver was a gunner who operated the forward-firing machine gun. Toilets and showers, or lack of them. Despite the tank being 26 feet or 8 meters long, there was simply not the space to install any kind of onboard toilet or washing facilities. And it didn't help that the tank was already woefully overloaded with all sorts of equipment and ordnance. So despite missions often lasting for days, all that was provided for the crew were some rags and buckets for washing and other bodily functions. To empty out one of the buckets, a crew member had to open the escape hatch to throw out its contents, but in the middle of combat, these waste-filled buckets would have to stay inside for hours at a time, adding to the stench of sweat and fumes in the poorly ventilated and hot interior. Dinner service. Often food like bacon and eggs could be cooked on board by being wrapped in tinfoil and placed on the top of the hot engines to slowly cook. But the ability to make the all-important cup of tea in a British tank didn't occur for another 30 years, with the introduction of the boiling vessel in the British Centurion tank, so the crew had to boil their water outside of the tank in makeshift petrol burners. The engine. The 29-ton tank was powered by a massive 19-liter 6-cylinder inline Ricardo petrol engine. The engine produced 150 horsepower, which is the equivalent to that of a modern-day Harley-Davidson motorcycle. This gave the Mark V a top speed of 5 miles an hour, about the same speed as that of a person walking briskly. Fuel tank. Despite holding 93 gallons or 420 liters of fuel, the tank only had a range of 45 miles. And though the fuel tank was armored, it could easily be penetrated by enemy heavy machine gun fire. As the tank was powered by petrol, it could explode when hit, setting the tank on fire, disabling it completely. So many crews were incinerated in this way that specially trained salvage crews had to be formed to retrieve their bodies out of the charred hulks. The starting handle. The tanks had to be crank-started internally using a large starting handle that had to be vigorously rotated with both hands in order to get the tank engine to start. The semaphore system. The semaphore system allowed for communication between tanks using a primitive signaling system of levers and discs on top of the tank, but this relied heavily on good visibility. Therefore, adverse weather conditions like rain or early morning fog made it next to useless. Battlefield smoke was also a problem too. The tanks also carried wicker baskets containing carrier pigeons that would have messages strapped to their legs and were released outside of the tank to fly back to base with messages. The armored exterior. The Mark V's armor had 16mm or 0.63-inch thick steel plate on the front, with 12mm or 0.47-inch on the sides, along with 8mm or 0.31-inch on both the rear and the roof. This meant that it was totally immune to all types of small arms fire, and it could also withstand heavy machine gun fire and grenade blasts on all but the rear and roof of the tank. The steel plate was just normal industrial grade and therefore quite brittle, so if the plate was penetrated, it was prone to splintering. If this happened, it resulted in small red-hot shards of metal shooting around the crew compartment with devastating effects. The crew would wear medieval-looking chainmail masks to protect their eyes, and gas masks were always close at hand. Weaponry. The male variant had a 6-pounder gun in each of the forward-facing portions of its sponsons, as well as a further 4 .303-inch machine guns scattered about the tank. One machine gun was located on each side of the sponsons, another facing backwards at the rear of the tank, and a fourth in the driver's cabin facing forward. The female variant was the same, except the 6-pounder were replaced with machine guns. 6-pounders were a short-barreled version of a British naval gun, so they didn't get stuck in the mud as they crossed the trenches or shell craters. The machine guns were the Hotchkiss M1909, which could fire as many as 10 rounds a second in short bursts. But the drawback was that the odor from the cordite propellant used in the machine gun's rounds, though smokeless, caused irritation to the eyes and lungs of the gunners inside the cramped and poorly ventilated interior of the tank. Ammunition. The 207 rounds for the 6-pounder gun was centrally stored, whereas the thousands of rounds for the machine guns were distributed about the tank next to the weapon ports for quick and easy access. The side sponsons. Turrets for tanks had yet to be fully realized, therefore sponsons were used at first. There was one located on either side of the Mark V tank. Each housed 2 weapons, one in the front of the sponson that had a very limited arc of fire and could only fire at targets in front of the tank. The other was on the side of the sponson and could only fire at targets to the side of the tank. Depending on the variant, the gun facing forward would be a 6-pounder gun on the male version or a machine gun on the female one. The side-facing gun on both variants was always a machine gun. After the war, these clumsy types of mountings were discarded as designers introduced more effective turreted designs. But a notable exception was the U.S. stopgap tank of World War II, the M3 Lee Grant. Observation post. An armored cabin on the roof of the tank was used for all-around observation, using a series of observation slits. There was also a peephole on both sides which the commander could also fire his 6-shot service revolver through if he needed to. These tanks were reasonably successful, though after the war they were gradually phased out of service, to be replaced with new tanks that had gun turrets and smaller crew numbers and proper dedicated suspension, like the Vickers Medium Mark II, that were also equipped with radios. Some Mark Vs were used in the Russian Civil War that ended in 1920. The last recorded use of them was in August 1941, when the Red Army used 4 of them as dug-in fortifications during the defense of Tallinn against the German invaders. Cross-section of the A7V Tank. One of the most iconic visual elements of the Second World War are German panzers blitzing their way across enemy territory, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. During the First World War, German tanks had a less than auspicious start. Their first attempt at a tank design was the A7V, a clunky metal box on tracks, a far cry from the formidable vehicles a quarter of a century later. In 1916, the Entente powers introduced the first tanks, hoping to break the long stalemate of the Western Front. Though limited, the success of the French and British tanks made it clear to the world that a new method of warfare had begun. Despite this, the German High Command was hesitant in adopting their own armored vehicles, and as late as 1917 were still relying on artillery and especially infantry, utilizing new stormtrooper tactics to break the stalemate. Undeterred by all of this, Germany did have some forward-thinking planners, and in May of 1917 the final prototype of the A7V, designed by Joseph Vollmer, was tested. After some modifications, production began in October, with the first A7Vs arriving at the front in March of 1918. The tank was named the A7V after Abteilung 7 Verkehrswesen, or General War Department Section 7, Transportation. The initial plan was to produce 100 A7Vs, though only 20 were actually made before the end of hostilities in November 1918. While plans were drawn up for other tank variants, none of these made it to the production line before the war's end, making the A7V the only tank that Germany actually produced. The vehicle was designated the Sturmpanzer Kraftwagen, or assault-armored motor vehicle. Crew compartment. The A7V had a much larger crew than its French and British counterparts, usually 18 men. These consisted of an officer, driver, mechanic, signaler, and 12 or more infantrymen to operate the vehicle's 6 machine guns. There were also 2 artillerymen on board to operate and load the cannon at the front. Sometimes they managed to squeeze up to 25 men inside the tank, mainly on the female variant. The inside of the A7V was a simple open space with no compartmentalization to separate the different sections. The engines were located in the center of the tank, with the officer and driver sitting above it, viewing the world through a cupola. Both these men wore asbestos-impregnated suits to protect them against the immense heat generated by the engines. The outside world was observed by small slits that provided limited visibility. The tank would be forced to make frequent stops as the commander reoriented himself. The rest of the crew operated the multiple weapons of the tank, including the main 57mm gun and 6 machine guns. Conditions in the vehicle were hellish, being extremely hot and cramped, and petrol fumes permeating the atmosphere. Crew members would often ride on the outside of the tank when not in combat to escape the discomfort. Access to the vehicle came from several rectangular hatches along the side of the tank. Weapons. The main armament of the male variant A7V was a bow-mounted 57mm field gun. A typical ordnance load consisted of about 180 rounds, divided between high explosive, canister, and standard munitions. Around the outside of the hull were located the 6 Maxim MG08 7.92 by 57mm machine guns, 2 on each side and a pair at the rear of the machine. Each tank would carry around 50 to 60 belts of machine gun ammunition, each belt containing 250 rounds. Though this was the standard armament, this could be adjusted based on circumstances. For example, one tank was modified into a female or all-machine gun variant, the 57mm gun replaced by a pair of Maxim machine guns. Each of the weapons was fixed in place, as the idea of a rotating turret had not been thought about by German engineers yet. As a result, each piece was constrained by a limited firing arc, especially the bow-mounted field gun. In order to bring this weapon to bear, the entire tank had to be shuffled about, which was a slow and cumbersome process. Armor. The armor of the A7V varied, being around 30mm thick at the front and 20mm at the sides. The top and underbelly of the tank was made of the weakest armor, a little over 10mm, thin enough to be penetrated by fragmentation grenades. The metal was also just regular steel, which was brittle. Even if a hit from enemy fire was deflected, the crew inside would be showered with fragments of metal. Names and artwork. Each A7V was christened by its new crew and was given a unique name. Some were given women's names like Gretchen or Lottie. Others were named after mythological heroes such as Wotan, Hercules, and Siegfried. The only surviving A7V is number 506, named Mephisto, short for Mephistopheles, a demon in Germanic folklore, associated with the character Faust, which incidentally was another named tank, number 503. Before entering battle, the crews would paint artwork on the vehicle. The Mephisto featured a red demon holding a white rhomboid, resembling the profile view of a British tank. Many of the tanks also had a skull and crossbones painted on the bow, but these would be painted over by a black and white cross patty, or German cross. After its capture, Mephisto would be repainted with a crowned British lion with its paw over an A7V. Engine. The A7V was propelled by a pair of Daimler-Benz four-cylinder petrol engines located in the center of the vehicle for a combined 200 horsepower performance. Two engines were used since there was no single engine large enough to power what would fit into the limited space of the tank's hull. These propelled the tank at around 9 miles per hour on roadways, though this was reduced to around 3 miles per hour on uneven terrain. Like its contemporaries, the A7V rode on Caterpillar tracks, increasing its traction. One advantage the tank had over the Entente designs was the armored plating of the vehicle, which covered the tracks, reducing their vulnerability to enemy fire. Fuel tank. The tank had a fuel capacity of 500 liters, or 132 gallons. Due to the engine's rapid consumption of fuel, this limited the range of the A7V to 60 kilometers, or 37.3 miles on flat roadways. Dimensions. The A7V measured in at 7.34 meters in length, or 24 feet, 3.1 meters or 10 feet wide, and 3.3 meters or just shy of 11 feet in height. They weighed in between 30 and 33 tons, and this variation was due to the manufacturing process, with each tank being made by hand with no standardization, leading to small changes between each vehicle. The boxy design was reminiscent of an armored railway car, though capable of movement under its own power. Chassis and suspension. The A7V was designed around the Holt tractor chassis, including a suspension of vertical springs. Due to the immense weight of the vehicle, the tank had a very low ground clearance, limiting its operations to roadways and flat, even terrain. In spite of the suspension, the ride was a bumpy one, and ropes were suspended on the roof of the tank for the men to grab onto and steady themselves when traveling over difficult ground. A7V in action. The A7V saw limited action during the war. The first operation was in March of 1918. There, the tanks were utilized in the spring offensive at St. Quentin. Two of the vehicles broke down before the engagement started, but the remaining A7Vs managed to help repel a British counterattack. On April 24, 1918, a trio of A7Vs were being used in support of an infantry assault at the Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, when they encountered 3 British Mark IV tanks, 2 of which were female variants, which just had machine guns, and a male variant which was equipped with 2 6-pounder cannons. During the fight, the British female tank's machine guns were totally ineffective against the A7V, and so they withdrew. The male tank remained and scored several hits on an A7V, disabling the vehicle, and its crew were forced to abandon it. This was the end result of the first ever tank duel in history. It was during this action that the Mephisto became trapped in a shell crater. Unable to extract itself, the crew abandoned the tank, which was later recovered by the British. It would eventually be transported to Australia, where it still resides today as a trophy and a museum piece. After its poor performance at Villers-Bretonneux, German High Command removed the A7V from active service, and the orders for 100 more vehicles were cancelled. The surviving vehicles would see limited service for the remaining months of the war, though the bulk of Germany's armored forces would consist of captured British and French tanks. After the war, most of the remaining tanks would be scrapped. In spite of the A7V's limited success, it wouldn't be the last tank in Germany's arsenal. Later German tank designs would incorporate the lessons learned from the Great War, leading to the development of some of the most famous and effective tanks ever built. Inside the M4 Sherman. One of the most famous aspects of the Second World War was the introduction of fast-moving maneuver warfare. Spearheading lightning-fast advances into enemy territory were high-performance tanks, a far cry from the clunky metal boxes of the First World War. Among the famous tank designs that roamed the battlefield, there are few as iconic or as controversial as the American M4 Sherman. By the 1930s, the United States lagged behind other world powers in tank development. As the build-up to war began in Europe, American planners devised the M2 and M3 tanks, vehicles that were hoped to be sufficient for any future conflict. After the outbreak of hostilities, a number of M3 Lees were shipped to Great Britain and renamed the M3 Grant as part of Lend-Lease agreements. Its performance was met with mixed reactions. The M3 was a robust and reliable tank that operated well in the harsh conditions of North Africa, but the positive features of the vehicle ended there. It had a tall profile, making it easy to spot and providing a large target for enemy fire. Another unfortunate aspect of its design, however, was the lack of a rotating turret. The main gun was mounted on a side-positioned sponson with a limited firing arc, which meant that the entire vehicle would have to pivot around to engage targets. With these limitations in mind, American planners used the blueprints of the M3 as well as the M2, but made it larger and more powerful. As early as April 1941, plans for the M4 Sherman were being drawn up, and by September of that year, the first prototype was ready for testing. After a few minor adjustments, the M4 was ready for full-scale production by February of 1942. Production and variants. The Sherman was designed to be simple and easy to mass produce. Over the course of the war, 11 factories churned out M4s in prodigious numbers. By the time the production had ceased, almost 50,000 were made, second only to the Soviet T-34 in sheer volume. Because of the simple nature of the M4's chassis, modifications to the basic design were easy to create, and numerous sub-variants were created, including more powerful tank destroyer versions, a flamethrower variant, and the chassis was used as the basis for a self-propelled howitzer, a tank recovery vehicle, and bridge layer. Dimensions. The M4 Sherman is classified as a medium tank, weighing in at around 30 tons, with a length of 19 feet 2 inches, a width of 8 feet 7 inches, and it was 9 feet high, though this can change somewhat with each sub-variant. Performance. The Sherman was propelled by a Continental R975 C1 9-cylinder engine, capable of producing up to 400 horsepower, and was able to reach speeds of around 30 miles per hour. Later variants were given more powerful engines that could generate up to 450 horsepower. The fuel tank could hold up to 175 gallons of gasoline, giving it a maximum range of around 120 miles. Due to the simple and reliable construction, the M4 could traverse up to 4,000 miles before requiring maintenance, enabling it to stay in the field longer than many other tanks of the era. Should repairs be needed, the simple design meant that the crews could perform basic repairs themselves, rather than needing specialized equipment or dedicated mechanics. Tank crew. The crew of a Sherman consisted of 5 men: the commander, the driver, a co-driver who also operated a machine gun, the gunner, and the loader. The interior of the M4 was spacious compared to many other tanks, and while the conditions were far from luxurious, it was marginally better than most contemporary vehicles. Access came from 4 hatches, 2 located on the front of the hull, another located on the top of the turret, and an escape hatch in the floor behind the driver's seat, which allowed the crew to abandon the vehicle in an emergency. The driver was located at the front left of the hull and steered the tank with a pair of control levers and floor pedals, with transmission controls directly to his right. Vision to the outside was originally provided by a vision slot, but this was replaced by a periscope. Drivers had a limited field of view and relied on the commander for accurate information to steer the tank. To his right sat the co-driver, who also operated one of the .30 caliber machine guns. Should the driver be incapacitated, he would step in as a replacement. Located behind was the gunner, who traversed the turret. Above him were the loader, who selected the appropriate ammunition and loaded the main gun, and the commander, who directed the tank and called out targets for the gunner to engage. The gunner would fire by flipping a firing switch and using a foot pedal. The tank's commander could view the outside world through a mounted periscope, but this limited the field of vision, so many commanders would stick their heads outside the turret for a more clear view, making their position the most vulnerable to enemy fire. Commands were given verbally over an intercom system, but experienced crews would communicate non-verbally, such as the loader tapping the gunner with his foot to indicate a loaded gun, saving valuable seconds on the battlefield. Armor. The Sherman was protected by up to 3 inches of steel armor plating, angled to help deflect incoming rounds. The armor was left deliberately limited in order to save weight, making the tank faster and more maneuverable, though sacrificing survivability to do so. The earliest version of the hull was made from cast steel, giving the tank its distinctive rounded appearance, while some later versions were welded. Later versions of the Sherman also featured thicker armor in response to encounters with their German counterparts. Tank crews in the field would often supplement the armor with improvised protection, often in the form of sandbags, cinder blocks, spare track links, or anything else they could scrounge. This type of armor provided limited additional protection, but also strained the suspension and engine, and General George Patton forbade this practice, though the troops continued to do it anyway. Armament. The first variants of the Sherman to roll off the production line were equipped with a 75mm main gun. This was generally effective against many earlier German tanks, such as the Panzer III and IV, though later tanks such as the Panther and Tiger could easily deflect the low-velocity round, especially against their frontal armor. With the 75mm gun woefully inadequate against more advanced German tanks, a more effective weapon was needed. The British first came up with the idea to equip the Sherman with the much more powerful 17-pounder or 76.2mm gun. This led to the development of the Firefly variant, which had a heavier suspension and an extended turret to accommodate the larger gun. This and other variants, including the E8 or Easy 8, would use a 76mm gun, which had a much higher muzzle velocity and were more than sufficient to deal with German armor. All versions of the Sherman's main gun, with the exception of a 105mm variant, came with a gyro stabilizer. In theory, it allowed the gun to maintain its elevation even as the vehicle bounced along rough terrain. In practice, the equipment was complex, and many crews lacked the proper training to use or maintain it, and many simply didn't use it. In addition to the main cannon, the Sherman was equipped with a pair of 30 caliber machine guns, one located on the right side of the frontal hull, the other coaxial to the main gun. A larger 50 caliber machine gun was mounted on the outside of the turret for both anti-personnel and anti-aircraft capabilities. Users and post-war service. Due to the vast numbers, reliable and simple design, and ease of production, the M4 was sent virtually to every major battlefront of the war. Though the vast majority were used by the Americans, Lend-Lease supply shipments saw Shermans in use by the British, Soviet, Free French, and other Allied armies. China was given 100 of the M4A4 variants by Britain to use against the Japanese forces in Burma. Even the Germans made use of a few captured tanks. Shermans also had an extensive history after the war, used as the main battle tank of the American armed forces in the Korean War, as well as by other nations, including Israel, Greece, Yemen, Iran, Iraq, India, Pakistan, and a host of others, even into the 1970s. Myths and reputation. Few tanks are as controversial as the Sherman. Its poor reputation stems from its inadequate performance against German tanks, especially the heavier Panther and Tiger variants. The earlier version with the low-powered 75mm gun proved futile against the frontal armor of these vehicles, forcing tank crews to maneuver for a shot to the side or rear of the enemy, often relying on sheer numbers to destroy the enemy tank from multiple directions. While it is true that the 75mm gun was underpowered for this role, they were continually produced even after the 76mm versions were created. The Sherman wasn't designed as a tank destroyer, but for general purposes. Most engagements that the Sherman found itself involved in was supporting infantry, and its targets were machine gun nests, bunkers, and field artillery pieces, something the 75mm gun was more than capable of dealing with. Another myth involves the nickname of the M4 as Ronson's, after the lighter company who had a slogan, "Lights the first time, every time." Ronson did not adopt that slogan until the 1950s, making the reference a post-war fallacy. It is true that earlier Shermans would burst into flame after being hit by the enemy, often launching the turret clear of the hull. This was initially blamed on the engine and the gasoline fuel, which combusts much more readily than diesel. A study performed by the Army soon found that this was not due to the engine, but it was due to ammunition stored in the turret, which could set off a chain reaction after being hit. This problem was mitigated by removing the ammunition stored there and adding additional armor plating to ammo storage areas. These and other myths give the M4 Sherman an unearned reputation as an inferior tank. Realistically, it had its flaws and shortcomings, but was a very well-built general-purpose tank that fulfilled its role on the battlefield well. Cross-section: the Panther Tank A7V. Whether deep in the wilderness or on the battlefields of the Second World War, it pays to be wary of big cats. One of the most legendary tanks of that conflict was the German Panzer V Panther, a vehicle which struck fear into the hearts of the Allies who faced it. Origins: while the search for a replacement for the Panzer IV tank began in 1938, the origin of the Panther began after Operation Barbarossa in 1941. In spite of the overwhelming success of the early stages of the invasion, German High Command began to worry about the effectiveness of its Panzer III and IVs against the Soviet T-34s and KV-1s they were encountering. After careful study of captured T-34s, a competition was set up to produce a new medium tank that could compete with it on the battlefield. Several prototypes were put forward from Krupps, Daimler-Benz, and others. The winning design was a prototype made by Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, or MAN, was selected in late 1942. After a few more adjustments, the newly developed tank went into production in January of 1943. It was given the designation of Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther, and it was first sent into combat that July on the Eastern Front. Variants: over the course of the war, there were several variants of the Panther. Confusingly, the first to enter production was the A7V, ASF being the abbreviation on the German word Ausführung, or version. The next model was the A7V, followed by the A7G. This is in contrast to other German tank designations, where the first type in a production run is given the A designation, then B, and so on. The G variant was the last production variant of the Panther to enter combat, though there was an F variant with the updated turret and a Panther II tank that was also planned, though the war ended before either made it to the production line. It was an update of the A7V on a redesigned chassis and had modifications to make production easier and cheaper. Dimensions: the Panzer A7V measures in at 29 feet in length, 11 feet in width, and a height of 10 feet. Or 8.86 meters by 3.42 meters by 3.1 meters. The weight of the Panther is 45 metric tons, slightly heavier than the D variant, though still considerably lighter than the Tiger, which weighed in at 54 tons. The Panther was a smaller and more maneuverable alternative to the Tiger series of tanks and was classified by German High Command as a medium tank. Crew: like all versions of the Panther, the A7V had a crew of 5 men, a commander, driver, gunner, loader, and radio operator, who was also a machine gunner. The commander would be located in a cupola at the rear of the turret, behind the gunner and loader. The driver would be seated lower in the hull on the left side of the vehicle. To his right would be the radio operator. In earlier versions, the driver would view the world through an armored viewport cut into the hull. In order to mitigate this obvious weak point, the opening was replaced by a single traversable periscope. This had the additional benefit of simplifying the production process. Armament: the main gun of the Panzer A7V, like all the other variants, was a 75mm high-velocity cannon. While this is the same caliber as the main gun of the M4 Sherman, it has a much higher muzzle velocity due to a larger powder charge and longer barrel. This gave the main gun of the Panther excellent armor penetration against Allied tanks. The A7V carried 82 rounds of ammunition for the main gun, a slight increase over the 79 rounds of earlier versions. The second armament of the Panther were a pair of MG-34 7.92mm machine guns. One was located in the turret coaxially to the main gun. The second was located at the bow of the gun and utilized by the radio operator. Armor: the A7V, like all versions of the Panther, made use of sloped armor, known as glacis plates, which was inspired by studies of the Soviet T-34. This feature increased the protection while reducing weight. In order to further reduce the vehicle's weight, the sides and rear would have thinner armor than the front. The frontal armor of the Panther was 80mm thick, and due to the sloping, meant that an enemy shell would effectively have to penetrate around 100mm of armor, something that many Allied guns, especially the 75mm cannon of the M4 Sherman, had difficulty in accomplishing. The sides and rear of the Panther were thinner at 45 mm in thickness, and the top of the tank was relatively thin at 30 mm. Because of the thickness of the frontal armor and relative vulnerability of the flanks, Allied tank crews would attempt to maneuver around the side of the Panther to score a kill. The A7V also had thicker side pannier armor compared to earlier variants, which protected the upper portion of tracks and suspension system. Engine and fuel. The Panther A7V was propelled by a Maybach V12 water-cooled petrol engine capable of generating 600 horsepower. It could move the vehicle at a top speed of 46 km per hour or 28.5 miles per hour. The fuel capacity was 730 liters or 190 gallons, giving the Panther an operational range of around 200 kilometers or 124 miles. The Panther A7V had a ZF AK7 200 transmission. This allowed for 7 gears moving forward and 1 in reverse. Production. During the course of the war, around 6,000 Panthers were built, the A7V making the majority of around 3,000. They were produced by a number of manufacturers, primarily Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, but also Maschinenfabrik Niedersachsen Hanover and Daimler-Benz. Night vision. A number of Panther A7V were equipped with the state-of-the-art FG-1250 Sperber or Sparrowhawk infrared night fighting scope. This device was located in the commander's cupola, where it was connected to an image converter and a machine that sensed the elevation of the main gun. This gave the commander a limited amount of night vision up to 600 meters away, though only the commander had this ability, the rest of the crew reliant on his orders. It's unknown how many were equipped with this technology, with estimates ranging from around 20 to over 50. In January of 1945, it was ordered that all Panthers would have this feature, though it's unknown if this was carried out. Flaws. In spite of its advantages, the Panther was not without its flaws. Like most German tanks, they were much more complex and unreliable compared to their Allied counterparts. The first was the track and suspension system. Like most German tanks, the Panther utilized 18 interleaved wheels, or road wheels that overlapped one another. Such a configuration gave the tank more mobility and more evenly distributed its weight, but it came at the cost of complexity. In order to repair the suspension system, several overlapping wheels would have to be removed to access the internal workings, a complex and time-consuming task, especially in a war zone. Many of the earlier variants of the Panther suffered engine and transmission problems, with significant numbers being out of action due to mechanical failures. By the creation of the A7V, many of these issues were mitigated, but the Panther did suffer from reduced reliability compared to their Allied counterparts. Another flaw was the Panther's armor. While the sloped armor of the Panther was generally effective at deflecting enemy shells, as the war progressed and Allied strategic bombing ravaged German industry, flaws in the manufacturing process made the steel brittle. Even if the shot was deflected, there was a risk that the impact would shatter the metal, damaging the tank beyond repair or making it vulnerable to a follow-up shot. The final flaw of the Panther was its limited production run. Of all the variants, around 6,000 were created, around 3,000 being the A7V, paling in comparison to the estimated 84,000 T-34s and 50,000 M4 Shermans they faced, any advantage in quality being nullified by sheer weight of numbers. Legacy. The Panther first saw combat on the Eastern Front in July of 1943. From then on, it served in all operational theaters. The Wehrmacht deployed tank forces until the German surrender in May 1945. During that time, the Panther garnered a reputation as one of the finest tanks in use by the Germans, being feared and respected by the Allies who faced it. Many argue about it being the best tank of the war, and in spite of its flaws, could possibly be considered among the top armored vehicles of the Second World War. Panther turrets. Cross-section. During the Second World War, the German army gained renown for their fast-paced maneuver warfare, which allowed them to overrun entire nations in short order. After their initial successes, however, the Wehrmacht found itself on the defensive. Though tanks and their mobility were still a vital part of the war effort, some were converted to a much more stationary role. Origins and concept. The idea of using tanks as a fixed bunker is obvious, at least in hindsight. Tanks by their nature are resilient, designed to withstand considerable punishment, while being able to unleash considerable firepower of their own. Furthermore, the First World War taught militaries around the world that tanks would be a vital component of any future conflict, and vehicles were produced in considerable numbers. These designs could become outdated quickly, as new technologies and methodologies led to the creation of more advanced tanks. Rather than scrap the obsolete designs, many were converted into makeshift bunkers at strategic locations. The first nations to do this were the Soviet Union, France, and Belgium. As they switched to a more defensive posture, the Wehrmacht made use of this tactic themselves, creating purpose-built tank bunkers. One type, nicknamed a Tobruk by the Allies after a Libyan city where they were first encountered, was a simple version of this concept. They were small, one-man bunkers usually armed with a machine gun or a small mortar, made from concrete, and topped with a small tank turret, such as captured French Renault light tanks. Sometimes, however, something more substantial was in order. Several defensive lines were devised by the German High Command to protect German territorial gains made in the early phases of the war, such as the Panther Wotan line on the Eastern Front, the Atlantic Wall in northern France, as well as others in Italy and Germany. This need led to the development of what was called the Panther Turm. Among the arsenals of tanks used by the Germans, one of the most effective was the Panther medium tank. The decision to use the modern Panther Turret as opposed to outdated designs was due to turret production outstripping the pace of Panther hulls. Rather than leave the already produced turrets in storage, they were pressed into service as stationary defenses. Variants. In the closing months of 1943, plans were drawn up for these lines of defenses, with Panther Turms as a key element. The basic idea was very simple. A bunker would be dug, with the tank's turret used as the main weapon. There were three main variants of the design. The Panther Turm Einstahluntersatz, or steel support, was the first variant, intended to act as a cheaper and less time-consuming alternative for typical German concrete bunkers. Steel bases were chosen over concrete ones because steel could be installed during the upcoming freezing winter months. Panther Turm Ein would be made with prefabricated steel components welded together on site. In places where the front was more static, such as the Atlantic Wall, the Germans made use of a second variant, called the Panther Turm 2 Betonsockel, or concrete base. These were sturdy, providing the occupants with significant protection. A third variant, called the Schnelleinbau, or fast construction, would be made from wood, and was also known as the Holzunterstand. Dimensions and sections. The bunker was divided into two major sections. The upper section was a square box roughly 3 meters by 3 meters and about a meter in height. Over the top of this section, the turret would be mounted. This compartment served as storage for ammunition and could hold up to 175 rounds of tank shells, while 4,500 rounds of machine gun ammo would be stored in the turret itself. The walls were up to 3 inches thick, providing the crew with significant protection. Underneath this upper chamber was a lower section. It was larger than the fighting compartment, around 6 feet in height, and was itself divided into different compartments. The first was the living compartment for the crew, which consisted of a commander, gunner, and loader, and had folding bunk beds and a stove that doubled as a heating system, which was attached to a flue for ventilation. Another section served as general storage, mostly for machinery and other odds and ends needed to maintain the bunker, and housed a 2-horsepower motor which powered the turret, a 150-amp battery, and a compressed air tank. The compressed air was needed to vent the barrel after firing, or the bunker would overheat, forcing the crew to open the hatches for sufficient ventilation, defeating the purpose of a sealed bunker. At the rear of the compartment was an escape hatch, which led to a vertical shaft, equipped with a ladder for access to the outside. Normal entry to the bunker was through a slit trench, which could measure up to 40 feet behind the installation. These were often connected to a much more extensive trench system. Turret and armament. For the most part, Panther A7V and A7V turrets were used for the role of stationary bunker. The Panther tank, regardless of type, utilized a powerful 75mm main gun. This is the same caliber it was found on the American M4 Sherman, which has a reputation as being a grossly underpowered main weapon. The German counterpart, however, had a more powerful powder charge to propel the shell and a much longer barrel, which allowed the expanding gases of the propellant to build up to a much higher degree, giving the shell a higher muzzle velocity. Because of this, the main gun could rip through all but the toughest armored vehicles. They were also equipped with a 7.92 coaxial MG-34 machine gun, useful for defending against infantry. The turret of the Panther was heavily armored, being up to 110 millimeters of steel at the front and around 80 millimeters at the sides, though this could vary based on the specific model of the tank used. This armor would also be sloped, which added to the protection provided by the steel. In addition to using the A7V and A7V Panther turrets, dedicated turrets were created. Based on the Panther designs, these were designated Panther Ostwallturm and were simpler in design than those placed on actual tanks. The name roughly translates as Panther East Wall Tower, as they were initially intended to be used on the Eastern Front, though due to the more dynamic nature of the fighting there, most were sent against the West, particularly in Italy and along the Atlantic Wall. Some were also improvised during the defense of Berlin in the final stages of the war. Panther turrets in combat. Panther turrets would be arranged in groups of 12, with interlocking fields of fire and connected to a larger defensive network. They would be positioned at strategic locations, ideally on elevated ground, though not at the summit, but slightly lower to decrease the silhouette. When properly installed, the Panther bunkers would have a low profile and could be camouflaged, meaning they could surprise an advancing enemy and, if discovered, were difficult to hit. The thick, sloped armor meant that even direct hits could potentially glance off. Because the armor was thicker at the front, enemies would often be forced to attempt to flank the bunker, putting them into the firing line of another emplacement. There were some downsides, however. The positions would be camouflaged, but this limited their firing arc. The turret could turn a full 360 degrees if there were no other obstructions, but this would push aside any concealment that may have been placed to mask it from the enemy. Once discovered, the low profile and durable construction made destroying it from the ground difficult. Panther turrets were, however, thinner at the sides compared to the front, making them vulnerable to flanking. By the later stages in the war, the Allies had near total air superiority, making the turret vulnerable to airstrikes as well as long-range artillery, for which they had no real defense against. Overall, the use of Panther Turm and other similar structures was a simple and cost-effective way to utilize scarce resources to hold on to ground already captured by German forces. In the later stages of the conflict, German logistics and industry was in shambles, and the use of the Panther Turm and other similar structures allowed them to recycle tanks that were already produced but were no longer operable. Tanks knocked out by enemy action, mechanical failure, or just a simple lack of fuel would not have to be scrapped or abandoned, but could still contribute to the war effort. Life inside Sweden's Stridsvagn 103. Sweden has been a neutral nation for the better part of 2 centuries. This, however, is an armed neutrality, and the Scandinavian nation has spent a considerable amount of time and money investing in military hardware to defend itself from possible aggression. During the Cold War, Sweden found itself in need of a new tank, one which emphasized the defensive nature of Swedish military philosophy. The result was the Stridsvagn 103. An odd-looking yet innovative chapter in the long and complex history of tank design. Origins and name. Plans for the Stridsvagn 103 began in the mid-1950s when the Swedish military sought a replacement for their primary tank, the British Centurion. Several ideas were proposed, including using foreign designs. Sven Berge of the Swedish Arms Administration proposed a domestic design that was called Alternative S or S-Tank. After some modifications, Alternative S was accepted as the Centurion replacement and became the Stridsvagn 103, which went into production in 1965 and saw service with the Swedish military starting in 1967. The name Stridsvagn translates as combat wagon. Dimensions. After studies during the Second World War showed that a majority of tank kills were from hits on the turret, the Stridsvagn did away with that feature, placing the main gun directly into the hull in a fixed position. As a result, the tank has a low silhouette, at only 7 feet, about 2.5 feet lower than the Centurion it replaced. It's also just under 12 feet wide and 29.5 feet long, and weighs in at 46.8 tons. Armament. The Stridsvagn 103 was armed with a Bofors 105mm L74 rifled cannon as the main gun, which fired the same ammunition as the British L7 105mm gun, which has been used on later versions of the Centurion and the German Leopard 1, among others. This was fixed in place pointing forwards, meaning that the entire tank would have to turn to fire on the enemy. Also, because of this, the gun could only fire when the Stridsvagn was stationary, an obvious drawback. This wasn't seen as a major issue, however, as Swedish military doctrine assumed that their forces would almost certainly be outnumbered anyway. And the winner of a tank duel was usually the tank that scored the first hit, making accuracy the primary priority. Though it may seem unconventional, having a main gun in a fixed position was not a new feature, having been used to great effect by the German Jagdpanther, among others. There's some argument that the lack of a turret makes the Stridsvagn 103 a tank hunter or an assault gun, though generally it's classified as a main battle tank. The Stridsvagn 103 also made use of an autoloader, which reduced the need for extra crew members and could carry 50 rounds of ammunition, and had a rate of fire of approximately 1 round every 3 seconds. Once the gun has fired, the empty cartridge casings are automatically ejected out of the back of the vehicle through a portal. In addition to the main gun, there were also 2 KSP 58 7.62mm machine guns, as well as a third that could be mounted on the commander's cupola. Armor. The Stridsvagn 103 was protected by sloped frontal armor that measured in at around 4 inches thick. The innovative suspension system could also lower the vehicle up to 5 inches, giving the tank an even lower profile. It could also be equipped with a bulldozer blade to help it dig a scrape into the ground so it could move into a hull-down position to avoid detection from the enemy. This also added to the thickness of the frontal armor. A metal fence accessory consisting of 32 welded vertical metal bars could be fitted to the front of the tank as protection against incoming heat rounds in a battle situation. Fortunately, this was never put to the test. Suspension and transmission. Because of the lack of turret, aiming the main gun was a major issue. To remedy this, the Stridsvagn was given a hydropneumatic suspension system, which could raise or lower the entire vehicle, with an elevation or depression range of 22 degrees, much more than many other tanks of the era. The tank was also maneuverable enough to swivel on its own axis to help with aiming. The transmission of the Stridsvagn 103 was automatic and could operate in reverse just as well as forwards. Engine and performance. Another innovative feature on the Stridsvagn was the engine, or more accurately, 2 engines. The first variant of the Stridsvagn was propelled by a Rolls-Royce K60 240 horsepower diesel engine for cruising and turning the tank to aim, and a 300 horsepower Boeing GT502 gas turbine engine for high-speed sprints. This would be replaced with a Caterpillar 553 gas turbine engine in later models, which could generate 490 horsepower. This was the first time a turbine engine would be used in a tank. This feature would later be copied in the Soviet T-80 and American M1 Abrams tanks. The top speed of the Stridsvagn was 37 miles per hour on flat open surfaces, riding on 4 rubber-coated road wheels. The Stridsvagn was also amphibious. It came with a built-in float screen, which took about 25 minutes to set up. Once in place, the tank could float, albeit at a greatly reduced speed of a bit under 4 miles per hour on the water. Crew. The Stridsvagn had a crew of 3, a commander, a driver, and a radio operator who could also drive the tank. The commander and the driver were seated in the front of the tank, and the commander would pass on firing information to the driver, who would turn the tank, aiming the gun. In addition, the commander had a duplicate set of controls on his side of the vehicle, as well as a set of gun sights allowing him to immediately take action when necessary. The commander also had access to smoke dischargers, which could obscure the Stridsvagn from the enemy when needed. The radio operator was seated in the rear of the tank, facing that direction. He also had a set of driving controls, allowing him to drive the tank in reverse if necessary, keeping the thick frontal armor facing the enemy, even as they withdrew. Original plans for the Stridsvagn only included 2 crew members, though this was increased to 3 to make tasks such as guard duty and field maintenance easier. Production and variants. The Stridsvagn went into production from 1967 to 1971. During that time, 291 vehicles were manufactured. 3 distinct models were made. The first, designated the Stridsvagn 103A, were the initial run of vehicles. The 103B were upgraded with a more powerful Caterpillar engine. and the 103C featured another engine upgrade, as well as an updated fire control system and laser rangefinder. A final version, the 103D, featured another fire control upgrade, night vision, and a few other minor modifications to the suspension and engine. Only one of these models was made, which was a modified C variant, though this never went into production. Service. The Stridsvagn entered service in 1967 with the Swedish military, which was the sole user of the vehicle. Its innovative design gave it a low silhouette, making it difficult to hit in a tank versus tank engagement. This, when combined with operating from an ambush position, made it an ideal choice for engaging enemy armed forces. However, the Stridsvagn 103 never saw combat, so its effectiveness is only theoretical. The primary rationale behind the Stridsvagn 103 was an emphasis on accuracy of the main gun and avoiding return fire. In the 1950s and 60s, most tanks lacked effective gyro stabilizers and had to fire from a stationary position anyway, making a turretless tank a viable option. By the 1970s, however, such stabilizers became more commonplace, allowing tanks to fire accurately while on the move, and the lack of a rotating turret was now a liability rather than an asset. The Stridsvagn 103 remained in service with the Swedish military primarily as a training vehicle until it was retired from service in 1997, replaced with the Stridsvagn 122, a modified version of the German Leopard 2. Today, only the D variant as well as several of the C variants are located at the Swedish Tank Museum and are still in running condition, and several others are found in tank museums around the world. While innovative, the Stridsvagn 103 was ultimately a dead end in tank design, and though it never saw frontline service, it still represents a unique chapter in the ever-evolving story of tank evolution. The KV-1 tank cross-section. The tanks of the Soviet Union are among the most widely discussed topics of the Second World War. The legendary T-34 was the most heavily produced tank of the conflict and the backbone of the Soviet armed forces. There were many other tanks employed by the Soviets though, and among these, the KV-1 stands out as worthy of some recognition. Origins. As early as the 1920s, the Soviet Union began development on what would be called deep battle doctrines, using fast, mobile forces to punch deep into enemy territory. For this tactic to be successful, it required a multitude of vehicles, including fast-moving armored scout cars, rugged main battle tanks, and larger, more robust heavy tanks that could shrug off enemy firepower while dishing out knockout blows of its own. In order to facilitate this heavy tank design, protection was required over speed or mobility. When multi-turreted prototypes such as the T-35 and T-100 proved infeasible, Soviet engineers trimmed down the design, creating a single-turreted KV-1. The smaller design was easier and cheaper to manufacture and could be more thickly armored. By the late 1930s, the KV-1 went into production and first saw combat against the Finns during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940. The KV-1 proved far superior to the T-35 and T-100, and it soon became the preferred heavy tank in the Soviet arsenal and was rushed into production. Designation. The KV-1 was named after the Soviet People's Defense Commissioner, Kliment Voroshilov. Originally, they were simply known as KV tanks, though later on other variants, including the KV-2 and KV-85 were produced, so the original models were named the KV-1 to distinguish them from their successors. Variants and numbers. There are numerous variants of the KV-1. The first was produced between 1939 and 1940, and in 1941 some of these were upgraded to the KV-1E, which had 20mm armor plates bolted onto the exterior, as well as an improved main cannon. Also in 1941, the KV-1B was produced, which featured extra armor, and later on a longer-barreled gun. Further armor upgrades came in 1942 with the introduction of the KV-1C. When these versions proved unwieldy due to the excessive heavy armor, some of the plating was removed, leading to the creation of the KV-1S, a lighter and more maneuverable variant. The chassis of the KV-1 was the basis for the KV-8 flamethrower tank, as well as the Su-152 self-propelled howitzer. The KV-1 was also the platform for the KV-2 howitzer, a turreted self-propelled howitzer with a 152mm main gun. In total, though, only a very limited number of KV-1s were produced, around 5,000 of all the sub-variants combined, a far cry from the roughly 84,000 T-34s that were also manufactured. Dimensions. The KV-1 is classified as a heavy tank and is much larger than the T-34, weighing in at 50 tons, with a length of 6.7 meters or 22 feet, a width of 3.35 meters or 11 feet, and a height of 2.7 meters or 9 feet, though this could vary based on the specific model. Armament. The KV-1's primary armament was a 76.2mm cannon. The type changed from version to version, the initial L11 main gun replaced by the longer-barreled F32 gun, and later the ZIS-5 cannon. These longer-barreled versions had a higher muzzle velocity which increased their effectiveness against armored targets. The original KV-1s were also equipped with a secondary armament of two 7.62mm Dektyarov coaxial machine guns. This number was increased on later models. Armor. As a heavy tank, the KV-1 had some serious armored protection, with the turret and the front hull 110mm thick and the sides 90mm. The KV-1C featured armor up to 130mm thick. This level of protection made the tank durable against all but the most powerful anti-tank weapons at the time, though it did make the KV-1 cumbersome and difficult to maneuver. Power plant, transmission, and speed. The tank was propelled by a 12-cylinder, 600-horsepower diesel engine. It had a top speed of around 42 kilometers or 26 miles per hour, though in practice, usually it didn't exceed 30 kilometers or 19 miles per hour, making it much slower than many other contemporary vehicles. The engine was underpowered for such a large tank, and it would wear out due to the strain of propelling such a gargantuan load. The KV-1 had a fuel capacity of 600 liters, or 158 gallons, with a range of around 200 kilometers or 140 miles. It had a 5-speed transmission with one reverse gear. This system was based off the Caterpillar Holt transmission used in agricultural tractors. The transmission was arguably one of the most poorly designed features of the tank. Because of the mechanical nature of the transmission, it required tremendous physical strength to shift gears. Some anecdotes recall drivers needing assistance with the gears, with some even resorting to using sledgehammers to move the levers. They were also unreliable, and a large number of KV-1s would have to be abandoned after suffering transmission issues. Crew. The KV-1 had a crew of 5, a commander, driver, gunner, loader, and radio operator. Conditions inside the tank were cramped, with the men situated in close proximity to one another. The driver was located in the center of the hull, the radio operator right next to him. The other 3 men would be squeezed into the turret, with the gunner to the left of the gun and the commander on the right, and he also operated the coaxial machine gun. There was no turret basket, which forced the loader to constantly shuffle around as the turret traversed. The tank suffered from poor visibility, with the driver viewing the world through small visual slits, covered in often fouled laminated glass, and also a periscope with a very limited field of vision. The commander had access to observation slits in the turret, as well as a pair of periscopes, though these also had a limited field of vision. All of these methods didn't cover a full 360 degrees, so the tanks had significant blind spots, making them vulnerable to ambush. KV-1 in action. There was a mixed overall impression of the new tank after it made its combat debut during the Winter War against Finland in 1939-1940, where it proved much more effective than the multi-turreted T-100. The KV-1 was in production at the time of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Though they were only made in limited numbers, they were highly effective against the German tanks and anti-tank weapons. The thick armor proved virtually immune to the 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns that the Germans employed, and the Panzer III and IV were equally ineffective. The only weapon that could be successfully used against the KV-1 at this stage of the war was the 88mm anti-aircraft flak gun, which was converted for use as an anti-tank artillery gun. In one incident near the town of Rasenia, Lithuania, a single KV-1 held off elements of the entire 6th Panzer Division, destroying a column of trucks, numerous anti-tank guns, and absorbing everything the Germans could throw at it without suffering significant damage, holding up the entire German division for 24 hours. In another action, one KV-1 knocked out 22 enemy tanks in a single battle, while receiving 135 hits to itself, but still remained operational. In spite of their effectiveness, the KV-1 was not just manufactured in a sufficient enough number to make a significant difference. With only a few hundred in operational service at the onset of the fighting, not nearly enough to turn the tide of the conflict. While the tank was heavily armored and difficult to destroy, the benefits of the KV-1 ended there. It was cumbersome and lacked mobility, and had difficulty crossing rivers, with all but the most sturdy bridges collapsing under its weight. Due to the weight of the tank as well as the rushed nature of its design and production, the engine was underpowered and under constant strain, and it, along with the transmission, proved unreliable, often breaking down, forcing the crew to abandon their vehicles. As the war progressed, more advanced German tank designs such as the Tiger II and Panther were able to defeat the heavily armored KV-1, nullifying its greatest asset. Such a large, slow-moving vehicle was also an easy target for anti-tank weapons, and it lacked the mobility to avoid these threats. Furthermore, the main gun of the KV-1 was the same type used on the T-34, which was a faster, more mobile, more reliable, and much cheaper and easier to produce tank. By 1943, production had ceased. In spite of this, the KV-1 remained in service, participating in most of the major operations of 1942 to 1943, including the relief of Stalingrad and participating in the Battle of Kursk in 1943. By that point, it was clear that the KV-1 was simply not up to the task of continued service. The remaining tanks were used as reserves, with the T-34s and newer IS-2s performing the heavy fighting, and the KV-1 just added as support when required. By the end of 1944, however, they were all but out of service and had largely faded from the Soviet arsenal. Sturmtiger cross-section. When tanks are designed, a number of factors are considered before the ideas on the drawing board eventually roll off the production line. Factors such as top speed, armor, fuel efficiency, ease of production, as well as strategic and tactical considerations are all taken into account before they join frontline service. Sometimes, however, designers do away with such ideas as subtlety and opt for raw power. To this end, German engineers created the Sturmtiger, an immense vehicle that saw combat in the later portions of the war, from the chaos of the Warsaw Uprising to the last gasp of the Third Reich in the Ardennes and Remagen, and signaled a final throw of the dice for the Wehrmacht. Origins. The Sturmpanzer VI A7V, also known as the Sturmtiger, has its beginnings in 1942. At that time, the Wehrmacht had already made use of the Sturmpanzer IV Brummbär, which was a Panzer IV that had the turret and main gun replaced by a 15-centimeter howitzer. The Brummbär was an effective vehicle, though in 1942 the German army became bogged down in heavy urban fighting in places such as Stalingrad, and it was obvious that something more substantial was required. The German High Command envisioned a large, heavily armored vehicle that could withstand whatever could be thrown at it from the confines of urban environment, and dish out enough firepower of its own to simply level any opposition. The Panzer IV hull was too small for what was expected, and so designers made use of the much larger Tiger I tank hull. When fitted with armor and weapons, the Sturmtiger was truly a gargantuan creation. Dimensions. The Sturmtiger weighed in at 65 tons, a full 8 tons larger than the Tiger it was based on, making it one of the heaviest tracked vehicles to participate in the war. It was a little under 21 feet in length, 12 feet wide, and 9.5 feet in height. The main gun was short, and due to its size and positioning added very little to the overall length of the vehicle. The armor of the Sturmtiger measured in at 6 inches at the front and was sloped at 47 degrees, giving it extra protection. The armor was thinner at the sides and rear, measuring in at 3¼ inches, and the roof was just under 2 inches thick. The Sturmtiger's armor was designed for urban fighting, where close-range threats could appear from any direction. The thick, sloped armor could shrug off most of what could be thrown at it. Armament. The Sturmtiger, which translates to Assault Tiger, was designed to simply flatten any opposition. To accomplish this, the original design featured a 210mm howitzer, though there weren't enough of these weapons available at the time. Instead, the Army turned to the Navy for help. The Kriegsmarine made use of a large depth charge thrower, designed to launch explosives at enemy submarines. After some modifications, the Army adopted the Raketenwerfer 61, an enormous artillery piece. Measuring in with a diameter of 380mm or 15 inches, the shell was propelled by a rocket motor, which meant that the barrel could be short, a little over 60 inches in length, without sacrificing range or accuracy. The Sturmtiger didn't have a turret, and the main gun was mounted on a fixed casemate. The shell itself came in two variants: the 4581 high-explosive round for destroying quote-unquote massed living targets, and it had a 275-pound explosive charge. The other version was a 4592 shaped hollow charge that could reportedly punch through around 8 feet of reinforced concrete. Both shell types weighed in at over 760 pounds, and each had a range of up to 6,500 yards. A special crane at the rear of the vehicle was needed to rearm the Sturmtiger, and could only carry 14 rounds, including one already in the gun and another on the loading tray. The immense pressure generated by the initial powder charge and the rocket required the gun to have ventilation tubes welded to the barrel to vent gases off and prevent damage to the barrel. In addition to the main gun, the Sturmtiger also had a 100mm mine launcher located at the rear of the vehicle, which could turn 360 degrees, launching anti-personnel mines. There was also a mounted MG-34 machine gun, which fired the 7.92 by 57mm Mauser cartridge, located at the front of the vehicle. Engine and performance. The Sturmtiger was propelled by a Maybach HL230 P45 V12 water-cooled gasoline engine with a 690 horsepower output. Even with such a powerful engine, the sheer size of the vehicle made its top speed around 25 miles per hour on roads and even terrain. It had a fuel capacity of 140 gallons and had a total operational range of about 75 miles, though this could vary greatly based on conditions. Crew and interior. The Sturmtiger had a crew of 5, the driver, who was positioned at the front left of the hull, the radio operator, who also manned the MG-34 machine gun at the front right, the commander, who was also the gunner, and 2 loaders, both of whom were necessary to handle the immense shells that the Sturmtiger fired. The interior of the Sturmtiger may seem spacious at first glance, but due to the position of the loading tray, as well as the considerable space taken up by the shells, the compartment was cramped, and the crew was forced to shuffle around in the claustrophobic environment. Production. In October 1943, the first prototype Sturmtiger was presented to Adolf Hitler, who approved of the design, and the production was set to begin. However, by this point in the war, the Germans were on the defensive, and Tiger hulls were desperately needed to produce conventional tanks, and none could be spared for the nascent assault gun. As a result, by Hitler's personal order, only hulls of disabled tanks undergoing overhaul would be used for the program, and it wasn't until February 1944 that the first Sturmtigers went into production. Due to these limitations, German industry could not produce large numbers of Sturmtigers, and only 19 were built before production halted in January 1945. Combat service. The Sturmtiger entered service in 1944 and were organized into 3 companies: the Panzersturmmusse Companion, or Armored Assault Mortar Companies, 1000, 1001, and 1002. These were originally designated to consist of 14 vehicles, though due to their limited numbers only had 4 each, divided into 2 two-vehicle platoons. The first time the Sturmtiger entered combat was during the Warsaw Uprising, where Company 1000 was deployed with 2 vehicles and the prototype. Incidentally, this was the only time the Sturmtiger was used in its intended role as an urban warfare platform, when it was used to bombard the city. Though the Sturmtiger was developed as a result of heavy fighting in urban areas on the Eastern Front, the majority of action the vehicles saw was on the Western Front. Sturmtigers were used during the Ardennes Offensive, also known as the Battle of the Bulge, the last major German offensive of the war. When that stalled out, the Germans were forced to fight defensively, and the Sturmtigers and their considerable firepower were used to stem the tide of the Western Allies' advance. 7 Sturmtigers were used at the battle for the bridge over the Remagen, where they achieved limited success. They were initially intended to bombard the bridge itself, though they proved far too inaccurate for this role. There are some indications that a group of Sherman tanks were put out of action by a hit from the enormous 380mm shell of a Sturmtiger during this action, representing the only tank versus tank kills the Sturmtiger achieved, though this is difficult to confirm with any certainty. They also played a role in the Battle of Reichwald in February and March of 1945, where they helped to stall the Allied advance and cover the German retreat. Legacy. Overall, the Sturmtiger had a limited effect on the war, given the small numbers that were produced. Most of the vehicles were captured by the advancing Allies and destroyed. Of the 19 that were produced, only 2 survived in the present day. One at the Deutsches Panzermuseum in Munster, Germany, the other located at the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia. A third was brought to Britain after the war, where it was used for testing, before being scrapped. The main gun, however, was saved and is currently located at the Bovington Tank Museum in England. Overall, the Sturmtiger played a very limited role in the war, being produced too late and in far too few number to make any significant impact. In spite of this, it's a tangible representation of the many oversized armored vehicles employed by the Wehrmacht during the Second World War. The Fray Bentos boys. Life inside a World War I Mark IV tank, cross-section. Deep in the heart of one of the most difficult World War I battles, a tank carrying 9 brave men survived for 3 days, stranded between a battle's 2 fronts. They left their mark on history as the longest tank action of the war. It was August 1917, and the now famous Fray Bentos tank and its crew were making their way through the Third Battle of Ypres, better known as the Battle of Passchendaele, at a not-so-speedy but very loud and bumpy 3 miles per hour. The 9-man team was made up of Captain Donald Richardson, 2nd Lieutenant George Hill, Sergeant Robert Misson, and 6 gunners, William Maury, Ernest Hayton, Frederick Arthurs, Percy Budd, James Binley, and Ernest Brady. Their battle station was the Mark IV tank that Captain Richardson had affectionately nicknamed Fray Bentos after the well-loved British tinned meat. This Mark IV tank, which entered service a few months earlier in May 1917, was one of the most prolific tanks of World War I. The Mark IV was the first British tank to be produced en masse, changing the scope of warfare forever. With thick steel plates cut, drilled, and hardened to be used for its 12mm thick armor, the role of the male Mark IV tanks was to knock out pillboxes and machine gun nests. This is exactly what the Fray Bentos and its crew were attempting when they got fatefully stuck on the 27th of August 1917. After firing on the Somme farm, the tank ran into a ditch just after 5:45 that morning near their next target, Gallipoli Farm. Originally, Richardson had been walking alongside the tank to deflect enemy fire, but after receiving wounds in his legs, returned inside just in time for it to get trapped. Despite being stuck in the mud, all was not lost for Fray Bentos. The rhomboid-shaped tank had heavy armament that the crew could still use to fire upon the German army, thanks to its 2 Ordnance QF 6-pounder guns and 3 Lewis 303 machine guns, 2 of which were positioned in the sponsons and 1 in the hull front. The crew also was carrying personal weapons that they could use for protection as they tried to unstick the Fray Bentos from the mud. Unfortunately, given the tank's position and the Germans who were in an old trench just in front, the Lewis guns were no good, aimed too low into the ground to help the tank's crew much. According to Misson's account, Hill, Budd, and Maury were hit as they went into the ditch through the very hatches designed for the crew to use to fire on the enemy with their personal weapons. Budd was knocked unconscious for 2 hours as the rest tried to rectify their newfound problem. First Sergeant Misson and Gunner Brady exited the tank under heavy enemy fire to fruitlessly try and dislodge the vehicle using the equipment strapped to it. Feeling bullets ricocheting around him, Misson jumped back in the tank, but it was tragically too late for Brady. He was shot and his body fell under the tank and sank into the mud as his crewmates watched, unable to do anything. If things didn't look sticky enough for the Fray Bentos, the Allies on their own side also started sniping at the tank in an attempt to prevent the Germans from taking it, and suspecting the crew dead or long gone. But they were still alive and willing to fight on. For a total of 3 days and 2 nights, the men of the Fray Bentos endured enemy fire and horrible conditions inside the 28-ton tank. It may have been a marvel of modern warfare and an effective weapon, but life inside was hardly peachy. Despite its armor, shrapnel still penetrated the hatches, injuring the crew inside in what were called sprays of hot molten metal. They didn't dare leave as they were experiencing enemy fire from all directions, and the Fray Bentos wasn't designed for prolonged multi-day attacks. It didn't have comfortable modern trappings like a toilet or even a water station. Instead, the men were forced to endure temperatures that could reach over 30 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and drop below freezing at night. The only available liquid was from water in the radiator or filthy, muddy water from where they were grounded. Having no other choice, that was what they drank in order to stay alive. Things were looking dire. At one point, a German soldier even succeeded in making it to the tank and dropped a grenade inside, which the British soldiers promptly threw back out. At around 7 p.m., over 12 hours since the tank first got stuck, with all but Binley wounded, Captain Richardson made an executive decision to tell Misson to head back to the British infantry and tell them to stop firing. If they were to get out of this alive, it wouldn't do to be shot by friendly fire just as they escaped the Germans on the other side. Of course, the Germans didn't get the memo and continued to fire on the tank for the next 3 days across the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th of August 1917. Above all else, the crew of the Fray Bentos were determined to do their duty and not let the tank fall into enemy hands. Any tank lost to the Germans would be a massive blow to their offense. Despite the war nearing its conclusion, the Germans hadn't focused on tank warfare and had none of their own to retaliate against the Allies. Instead, they focused on defense or repurposing those they captured, which was why it was imperative Fray Bentos stayed out of their hands. But life inside the Mark IV wasn't pleasant. Putting aside the enemy fire, wounds, potential shrapnel, heat, and muddy water, a cramped tank wasn't a great living space at the best of times. The only place to sit was beside the 70-gallon engine and transmission. This meant that while in the tank, on top of everything else, the crew was assaulted by a cloud of gas, carbon monoxide, oil smoke, and cordite from shells that they inhaled every time they breathed, leading to nausea and long-term side effects. It was cramped and intimate, and not in a good way, with the transmission noise so loud that the crew often had to scream at each other to be heard. In fact, braving the outside probably seemed less horrific in some respects because at least the air was somewhat fresher. The fight with the weary Fray Bentos boys continued on until the 24th, when Captain Richardson decided enough was enough. After over 60 hours of constant assault, they would make a break for it back to British lines, taking not only their weapons and maps, but unhooking and taking the Lewis guns also. The crew exited the tank at 9 p.m. August 24th. Forced to literally crawl on their bellies across the mud, the remaining members of the Fray Bentos tank crew, sans Brady, slowly made their way to the British lines. Finally, after an arduous journey and a record-breaking extended siege in their tank, the surviving crew had made it. They encountered the 9th Battalion, also known as the Black Watch, who took the weary men in and tended to their multiple wounds. The battle for the Fray Bentos was over, and luckily, the Germans never succeeded in capturing the tank for themselves. All the men who had endured the 3 days inside Fray Bentos received recognition for their calmness and stoicism under heavy fire. Captain Richardson and Second Lieutenant Hill received the Military Cross, while Misson and Maury were awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. The other members, Hayton, Arthurs, Budd, and Binley, received the Military Medal. Sadly, Budd didn't survive to see the end of the war, dying a year later, aged 22. Captain Richardson went on to command another tank he lovingly called the Fray Bentos II, although it couldn't possibly live up to the legacy of its predecessor. The Fray Bentos II was captured and presented to Emperor Wilhelm II. At the end of the war, the affectionately nicknamed Fray Bentos boys were officially recognized as the most decorated tank crew, undergoing the longest tank action of World War I. Fiat 2000 Tank Cross-Section. Arguably, the most significant technological development of the First World War was the creation of the tank and the way in which they rolled their way inexorably across no man's land, changing the nature of warfare forever. Tanks that were designed by the British, the French, and the Germans are the best known and are the basis of modern-day armored vehicles, but some other nations, which are often overlooked, also contributed to the development of tanks. In order to try to gain an advantage on the battlefield, Italy set out to develop a tank of its own, resulting in the Fiat 2000, an innovative, if forgotten part of the Great War. Origins. Italy entered the war in 1915 alongside the Allied powers, their primary adversary being the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with most of the fighting taking place in the rugged terrain of the Alps. As early as October 1915, Italian car manufacturer Fiat began development of an armored vehicle that would, hopefully, give the military an edge over their opponents. However, the process was so slow that the government turned to the French, who delivered a Schneider CA-1 and later on Renault FT-17s, which became the backbone of Italy's tank force. It wasn't until 1917 that the Fiat design was finally ready for testing. Compared to the 6-ton Renault or the 15-ton Schneider, the Fiat 2000 was a gargantuan 40-ton behemoth of a vehicle. Testing was started in June of 1917 with the first prototype. Although it was an incomplete vehicle, the mechanics of the main body hull were in place, but the superstructure consisted of a wooden mock-up, since the actual metal parts weren't finished. Later on, a second prototype would be made with some alterations to the basic design. Only 2 prototypes of the Fiat 2000 were created, and though very similar, there were slight differences between them. The most obvious difference is the armor plating, with the metal skirt of prototype number 1 being made of several armored plates welded together, whereas prototype number 2 being made of a single piece of metal. The exact arrangement of the weaponry was also slightly different, with the machine guns of number 1 being placed directly front and back, while those on number 2 placed at the corners of the superstructure. Dimensions. The Fiat 2000 was an immense vehicle, one of the largest produced during the First World War. It was much heavier than any other tank of the conflict, including the German A7V. It was just over 24 feet in length, 10 feet wide, and 13 feet in height. The boxy structure made the tank resemble a pillbox, and many contemporary sources refer to the vehicle as a mobile fort armament. The Fiat 2000 was heavily armed, though, capable of dishing out a tremendous amount of firepower. The primary armament was a 65mm howitzer, which was a compact artillery piece that was designed for use in the mountains. The gun would be placed in a dome-shaped turret on the top of the vehicle, which could rotate 360 degrees, with a depression of -10 degrees and an elevation of 75 degrees, giving the tank a wide field of fire. To protect the tank and its crew from enemy infantry, it had numerous portholes located around the hull that could be fitted with up to 8 Fiat Ravelli 6.5mm machine guns. The machine guns were positioned with various configurations, with the intention of covering the tank from all angles. Armor. The Fiat 2000 armor was thick by First World War standards, ranging from 10 to 15 millimeters on the sides and rear, and up to 20 millimeters at the front, more substantial than most of its contemporaries. The structure of the tank did slope upward slightly, though at too shallow of an angle to be considered true sloped armor, which meant that the tank relied on the thickness and toughness of the armor plating to deflect enemy fire. Crew. The number of crew originally allocated to a tank was set up for 10 men, though most of these operated the machine guns, but since it was unlikely that all of the weapons would be needed at the same time, the crew would likely be reduced to around 8. The driver sat in the center at the front of the tank and viewed the world either through a periscope or, if circumstances permitted, through a large hatch at the front of the vehicle, though this would place the driver and the rest of the crew at risk and would only be done when not in a combat situation. The crew would enter through a hatch on the left side of the tank and would position themselves in the designated crew compartments, which was located above the engine, transmission, and other internal workings, separated by a bulkhead. With the crew compartments separated, the men had more room to maneuver compared to the tanks of other nations. Power plant and performance. The vehicle was propelled by a single 6-cylinder Fiat A12 aviation engine, which had a power output of around 250 horsepower. The engine was primarily used in aircraft, and as a result, the tank ran on aviation fuel. Because of the immense weight of the tank, the top speed of the Fiat 2000 was around 4 miles per hour on flat, even surfaces, about the speed of a brisk walk. This was not seen as detrimental, since at this point, tanks were seen as ways to support infantry advances, rather than striking out on their own. And so having a top speed faster than an infantryman could advance was unnecessary. service life. Though innovative in its own way, the Fiat 2000 was ultimately a failure. It was just too large and cumbersome to be of any use on the narrow mountain passes of the Alps, where the bulk of Italy's fighting was taking place. Another issue plaguing the process was the slow speed of development. Though the idea initially started in 1915, it wasn't until 1917 when the first prototype began testing, and this was just the hull, lacking the proper superstructure, with the second vehicle remaining unfinished until February 1918. The program was cancelled on November 4, 1918, just days before the ending of hostilities. Prototype number 2 was deployed to the Piave River, the site of the last Austro-Hungarian offensive into Italy during the war, though there's no indication that it was used in combat, and was likely just there to conduct tests. After the war, no further prototypes of the Fiat 2000 were built, though they did see some combat. In 1919, revolts in parts of Italian-held Africa led to the deployment of at least one tank to Libya. Sources are unclear as to whether both prototypes were sent, or only prototype number 2. In any event, either one or both of the tanks were part of a force sent to recapture the city of Jarabub, although exactly how they performed this in the campaign is a mystery. In spite of this, Libyan dictator Umar Gaddafi depicted the Fiat 2000 on a series of stamps, including a commemoration of a battle that occurred in 1913, well before the Fiat 2000, or the very idea of a tank in general, even existed. The ultimate fate of the two prototypes is also a source of debate and speculation by historians. The last known photograph of prototype number 1 was taken in 1924. An inventory of vehicles and equipment taken in 1925 and 1926 lists only one tank. Prototype number 2 is known to have existed into the 1930s, so its companion is presumed to have been scrapped, though this cannot be confirmed. As late as 1934, prototype number 2 was modified, replacing the forward-facing machine guns with 37mm cannons. It was used for training as well as propaganda purposes, though its eventual fate is unknown. Shortly after this modification, the final Fiat 2000 disappeared from records and history, presumably having been scrapped. By the time the Second World War broke out, it had disappeared without a trace. As it was only Italy's first attempt at a tank design, it was quite innovative in its own way and did include features found in modern tanks, such as a rotating turret. It ultimately proved unsuitable for combat and was far outstripped by other tank designs. The next Italian tank to be produced was the Fiat 3000, which was based on the French Renault FT. When it was created, tank design was still in its infancy, and the Fiat 2000 was a creative attempt to build an effective vehicle from the ground up, an experiment that represented the growing pains of a new type of warfare, one which would eventually dominate battlefields around the world. In 2017, work began on creating a full-sized replica after a 1/5 scale wooden model was found and purchased by an Italian military vehicle restoration group, Spa Militaire. After crowdsourcing financing, the group managed to build a fully functional replica of the original, which was completed in 2020. It now resides at the Museo Civico delle Forze Armate, 1914 to 1945, in Vicenza, Italy. In addition to being a museum exhibit, the tank was also intended to be commercialized, being used in movies, rentals, and other displays, which will help fund the restoration and recreation of other historic Italian tanks and vehicles. We upload all the videos that we have to censor from YouTube to our Patreon. Right now, you can watch uncensored videos on the Battle of Compiègne, medieval warfare, and the Sherman tank, all on Patreon. History is epic. Watch it uncensored.